Papa Gold 091. Search for 94 nautical Papa Gold 91.
The Baltic. Seen first as a small, cold sea, rather shallow and long, left to the devices of fishermen and amber dealers. Yet from the Middle Ages onwards, it became one of the major economic hubs of Europe, to the point of becoming one of the hotspots of global geopolitics today. 8 European countries live around the Baltic Sea: Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and then there is also Russia, and its territory flanking the heart of Europe, Kaliningrad. Behind these apparently peaceful locations and opulent cities lies a long and unique history, by turns written by Vikings, Teutonic Knights, gatherings of traders from the Baltic, the Hansa, and all the men of arms, local wars and annexations, czars and paupers, Stalin and Nazis, exterminations and constantly redrawn borders, the Iron Curtain and NATO, and up there, Russia, reassuring no one. With the end of the USSR, the Russians in the Baltic Sea lost their power. Farewell Poland, Baltic states, East Germany. Farewell communist lands. A violent reorganization, some would say a butchering, experienced by the new Russia as a humiliation. And today, there is cause for concern. Estonia, March 2022. 3 weeks after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 300 French soldiers came to reinforce the defenses of the Baltic countries alongside other European battalions. They are united under a common banner, that of NATO, the bugbear of neighboring Russia.
Attention! Item number 6. In the current context of high tensions and security threat after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our head of armies, the President of the French Republic, declared, France will continue to play its full role of reassuring NATO allies by sending a new contingent to Estonia as part of the enhanced forward presence to ensure a dissuasive presence and be capable of contributing to the country's defense. Announcement over. At ease.
It's not the Third World War yet.
World War or not, the shockwave from the Russian invasion is considerable for the Baltic perimeter. Might Estonia and its 2 Baltic neighbors be next on the Kremlin's list?
Here we have a framework that is totally dissuasive, preventative, and non-aggressive. It's a matter of reassuring our Estonian friends, telling them that we are with them and contributing to their defense.
NATO forces have been present since 2017 in the 3 Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as Poland. Since the war in Ukraine, this presence has been strengthened.
Today, we've gone from a dissuasive position to a defensive position. More and more military contingents are arriving here. What the soldiers of the enhanced forward presence have done is to train our allies in territorial defense in the Baltic countries.
Kaliningrad belongs to the new generation of women presidents or prime ministers of countries around the Baltic Sea. In Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway.
The day that the flags of the Allies were raised on the military base of Tapa, I lined up with the soldiers from other countries who just arrived. The countries of NATO's enhanced forward presence include British, French, Danish, and Icelandic forces who are also contributing. And I was acutely aware that Moscow had seen these images and didn't like it at all. When I say that obviously we have nothing to worry about and that NATO will protect us in all circumstances, I believe it. But on the other hand, NATO must always adapt.
NATO. This North Atlantic Treaty was signed in the United States in 1949. It was important to be forearmed against any attack from the Soviet Union against a member state of Western Europe. The Warsaw Pact was to be the communist response.
Le pacte de Varsovie, l'équivalent à l'est de l'OTAN à l'ouest, a été renouvelé aujourd'hui pour 20 ans. La signature a eu lieu à Varsovie, où s'était déplacé le nouveau numéro 1 soviétique, M. Gorbatchev, qui effectuait là son premier voyage officiel à l'extérieur de l'URSS.
2 blocks and an Iron Curtain. Yet even then, the communist Baltic was more than just a place of tension and confrontation.
In my childhood, the Baltic Sea for me was the place for summer holidays, basically.
Rarely are such images of happy holidays associated with the communist yoke.
But I remember that this Baltic Sea was not really connecting people across the Baltic Sea, but it was dividing. It was a border sea. It was the sea of confrontation, of the Cold War confrontation. I remember still the beaches in Poland being plugged by the army in the night, so they could see if someone was not trying to escape, or that someone haven't entered through the sea unnoticed. So they were hoping to see the traces on the sand.
Along the banks of the Baltic today, former bunkers recall secular militarization.
I'm the generation, I became 18 in 1989, so that was exactly the time of the end of communism in Poland, the end of Berlin Wall. Everything was changing.
I remember the human chain, the Baltic Way of 1989. It was an event shared by the 3 Baltic countries to show that we exist and that we can now stand together side by side. Of course, the communists in Moscow didn't like that, but they couldn't do much about that anymore. The Soviet Union was so weak. I think that it was a powerful message sent to the rest of the world that something was changing, and I took an active part in it. I was on the border between Estonia and Latvia. I remember an Estonian choir crossing the Latvian border on foot, singing songs forbidden in the Soviet era. We were no longer afraid of anything. I still think that the lives of Estonians, those of my generation, radically changed. We were free. We could say anything, do whatever we wanted to, leave this country and return to it. It was unprecedented.
Freedom has a price, and from their independence in 1991, the Baltic countries feared their big Russian neighbor. They all chose to rally together and join the Western world. The West was obviously delighted about that. The Warsaw Pact disappeared with the fall of the wall. However, NATO was not dissolved. Far from it. It contains 30 member countries, including 21 from the European Union, with Sweden and Finland soon to follow. This constitutes a veritable revolution for these 2 countries, previously resolutely neutral or semi-neutral, as well as an unbearable provocation for Russia.
We basically set our course on making sure that we are not alone, that we'll be joining all the Western clubs and organizations possible. culminating in 2004 with us becoming members of European Union and NATO. And ever since that time, 2004, we have been trying to make sure that while we are at the periphery of the European Union geographically, that in decision-making processes, we have to and we want to be at the very core and at the center of Europe. Because there is an old saying that if you are not at the table, you are at a menu.
The fear of being eaten alive and the voluntarism displayed by the Baltic states has given them credence at the heart of European power and in the face of their formidable Russian neighbor.
And basically that meant that we set out to make sure that the other side, Russian Federation, knows that NATO is in Estonia, is ready to fight from day one, and there is no room for miscalculation in the heads, or one head particular, in Kremlin.
An abundance of images for the edification of public opinion on both sides. Europeans are not the only ones maneuvering. Russia has been multiplying its exercises to scale. It is happening in Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave nestled between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic Sea, in the heart of the new Europe. Kaliningrad. This German territory was given to the Russians as a spoil of war in 1946. The Germans at the time had several hours to shut up shop, manu militari. Today, Kaliningrad has a population of around 1 million Russians. It is mainly supplied by Moscow, thanks to a railway line crossing Lithuania and Belarus. Kaliningrad remains one of the last major Russian ports on the Baltic, and above all, an advanced base in the heart of the Western world. Russia makes liberal use of this asset. So here, on most beaches, holidaymakers are not welcome. Since 2015, Russian ballistic missiles have proliferated at the whim of simulated nuclear raids. Swimming would be very ill-advised. All the more so, since the Baltic is one of the most polluted seas in the world. After World War II, chemical weapons, bombs of all kinds, and the wrecks of warships were all jettisoned into the water. Not to mention the chemical products and industrial waste poured into it daily.
In the Baltic Sea, we find many remains of past wars. That is why demining is a priority for us. These are mainly ammunition rounds that did not go off during the war. And it is precisely this old ammo that must be evacuated. We have also mentioned it in the coalition agreement, and I'm very optimistic. We will manage to make progress in this area in the next few years.
It is not certain that these environmental ambitions are the primary concern of Russian Kaliningrad, which is much too caught up in the supposed threat from NATO forces.
Well, Russia has sort of justified the strengthened military posture in Kaliningrad by the NATO forces that, from the Russian perspective, is amassed in the three Baltic countries and Poland. And I think it's part of the Russian propaganda to say that the threat, Western threat towards Kaliningrad area is real and is something that Russia and Moscow has to respond to.
Since the fall of the wall and the end of communism, the West seems to have triumphed over Russian imperialism and almost set the borders in stone. Some evoked the end of history, but actually, that's not at all the case.
The Cold War was over. The United States and Western countries had superior military technology. These reasons, and many others, led European countries to think that there simply wasn't any threat of a major war. Consequently, many European countries, in fact, the majority of these countries, removed compulsory military service, replacing it with a professional army of several tens of thousands of soldiers and abolishing the infrastructure used to build a conventional warfaring army on a grand scale.
Je propose donc que le service national que nous connaissons aujourd'hui soit supprimé dès le 1er janvier 1997.
In those years, mandatory military service was scrapped in Belgium, Spain, Slovenia, Italy, Poland, Sweden, Germany. And in its place, a career army. It was in 1992, in an era of mutual trust, that the Council of the Baltic Sea states was created to promote the identity of the region and stimulate trade. It is currently presided over by Germany. Since its creation, Russia had its legitimate place there, up until its withdrawal in May 2022. At that time, there was a sort of dream of rebuilding what the Hansa of the Middle Ages had been, the association of merchant cities that maintained prosperity and balance in the whole region for 3 centuries, as far as Veliki Novgorod, in the heart of Russia.
It's true that the situation in the Baltic Sea region 30 years ago was very different. That was the period that followed the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Iron Curtain. That's why the Council of the Baltic Sea States was created, to foster democracy, peace, stability, and human rights in the Baltic Sea region.
It was also in 1997 that other countries started trading unquestionably with Russia, this new, reliable partner. On the impetus of Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder and Vladimir Putin, a highly ambitious energy project was devised, Nord Stream, with construction work commencing in 2005, allowing Russia to deliver its gas to Germany and an entire region of Europe. This 1,200-kilometer-long gas pipeline roamed the depths of the Baltic Sea. It was inaugurated in 2012 without anyone questioning the new European dependency on Russian gas.
Parce que la sécurité énergétique est un des fondements de nos économies, l'Europe doit diversifier ses sources et ses voies d'approvisionnement. La création de ce nouveau gazoduc répond à cet impératif.
During all these years, France and the whole of Europe no longer feared Russia, which was not to Vera Vika-Freiberger's liking. She was the president of Latvia between 1999 and 2007.
I recall conversations I had with Mr. Chirac, and I said to him, Mr. President, you have a very romantic view of Russia. And he frankly acknowledged he had a romantic view of Russia. What attracted him is that he shared with Russia the idea of grandeur and culture. And Mr. Putin obviously had played on that heartstring. Almost every time he met Putin, he was more sympathetic towards Russia than ever.
The Baltic countries raised the alarm but were virtually ignored. They live near Russians and, usually, have a degree of discernment.
I had a meeting with Mr. Putin on neutral territory, literally on Austrian territory, where he went skiing with his family, and also to buy 3 fighter jets from Austria, from the Austrian government. And already from the first meeting, he'd indicated he considered it a great tragedy that there was a border between our 2 countries. I answered that the end of the Soviet Union had been a disaster for him, but for me, the happiest day of my life, and also for many of my compatriots.
The situation was to deteriorate without many people seeing it coming.
After this initial enthusiasm of the 1990s, where we were really focusing on collaboration, building bridges, and bringing all around the table, sometime in 2000s, the Baltic Sea again became the place of geopolitical tensions. So it was the place where Russia was meeting the EU and NATO, and that was the source of the geopolitical tensions.
We had a leadership in Russia who made quite clear that they were unhappy with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, who started to question borders that had been agreed.
How far back was the wake-up call?
It started really in 2014, after the illegal annexation and occupation of Crimea by Russian Federation, and when the war in, basically Russia perpetrated war in Donbass started. And, which has been going on for 8 years.
I would actually personally go further back in time. I was actually at NATO headquarters in 2008 when the war between Russia and Georgia started. There were, of course, discussions, who had provoked whom, but you definitely saw already Russian aggression towards its neighboring countries.
C'est une image qu'on croirait sortie d'un autre temps, celle de ces fermiers géorgiens apeurés, fuyant en calèche l'avancée des chars russes. Ouais, on va prendre Tbilissi, on va tout prendre. La Russie gagne toujours. Aidez-nous, crie cette femme. Qu'avons-nous fait de mal pour mériter ça?
Very clearly, after 2008 and 2014, the European Union's reaction towards Russian aggressions were too weak, including when it comes to the energy links.
Try to imagine for a moment if today's sanctions had applied while Russia was partially occupying Georgia and showed for the first time that it was calling international law into question.
And the result is, of course, that, aggressor sees that aggression pays off, there are no real consequences, and of course it's rational to think, let's take another bite.
The illegal annexation of Crimea was definitely a wake-up call for my country, as for most other European countries, and for the alliance as a whole. Sweden took a major new decision in terms of basically doubling its defense budget out of worry of what we had seen happening in Crimea, and also with a renewed focus on territorial defense. With the decision 2015, for instance, Sweden decided we will now have to develop 2 new submarines in order to patrol the eastern border, the eastern waters, and the Baltic Sea.
In Sweden, mandatory military service was abolished in 2010, but it was re-established 7 years later. The Swedish island of Gotland became a vast theater of operations. Provocative and threatening, the Russians regularly violated its airspace. The Swedish government, in response, multiplied demonstrations of force.
Gotland has always had a strategic position in the Baltic Sea. If you control Gotland, you can influence the maritime traffic in many ways, and to a certain extent, the aerial traffic occurring over the Baltic Sea. Gotland Island is within range of the Russian missiles in Kaliningrad, and similarly, from Gotland, long-range weapons can reach Kaliningrad.
Here in Gotland, we thought it was a mistake when Gotland demilitarized in the early 2000s. But confidence was very high. They thought that Russia really wanted to take a democratic path. However, we had a very negative attitude to this military withdrawal from Gotland. The population of the island now welcomes the decision to have the army on our territory again.
Civil society needs us to defend it, but we also depend on the support of civil society in the event of crisis or war.
Since the invasion of Ukraine, the phenomenon has grown to striking proportions. Whether it be in Sweden, Norway, or Finland, everywhere, territorial defense leagues are being formed, and volunteers have answered the call. The army can count on a crowd of citizens ready to fight immediately.
My name is Christer Wingren. I'm 56 years old and I work as a teacher at a high school in Gotland.
My name is Julia. I'm 22 years old. Since the invasion of Ukraine, I felt like I didn't want to just sit there with my arms folded, doing nothing.
Make sure you have your rifle well balanced and the target in your crosshairs. Go!
There's a sense of duty.
Unload! Aim! Johan Carlson. I'm a commander and leader of the reserve battalion in Gotland. Here in Gotland, we have 350 soldiers. We have 3 companies. Our task is to mount the guard and protect key locations. This can be buildings and other things, civilian or military sites. Another mission consists of watching and controlling everything that happens on the island and reporting unusual activity. For instance, car license plates that don't usually circulate on the island. Basically, we know where every tree and every house is found. We are posted on the island, and we know its residents. There is always a bit of fear of Russians on Gotland.
The fear of Russians, in Sweden, even has an entry in the dictionary, known very officially as riskräk. We are seeing a resurgence from far away, very far away, of an old aversion towards Russia and its expansionism. In the anxiety-inducing collective memories, the Great War of the North, a conflict in 1700 for 20 years, which, in a nutshell, opposed Peter the Great's Russia and Sweden and affirmed Russia victorious as the leading power in the Baltic Sea and a decisive player in European affairs. Another traumatism, the Winter War, which saw Stalin's men invade Finland in 1939. For the Finnish, what Ukrainians are experiencing today essentially evokes what their grandparents experienced during this emblematic war. The fierce resistance of the Finnish is etched in people's minds. They fought the Red Army 1 against 4. Heroic disproportion and victory for Finland. A colossal disaster for the Red Army after about 100 days of combat. Despite its victory, little Finland knows to stay within its lane when it comes to its powerful, very powerful neighbor. And to describe its prudent position, the term Finlandization was invented. The country declares its neutrality. Was it really such a clear victory for Finland? Its long border with Russia forces it then to never defy the power of its neighbor. But in exchange, Finland will keep its sovereignty. all the while actively maintaining its army, just in case. After it joined NATO, the cards were redealt, to the great displeasure of Russia.
We have 1,300 kilometers of shared border with Russia, meaning that there are many subjects of a practical nature that we discuss regularly. Flows of people and goods, the environment, and many other things that we are naturally constantly evoking with Russia. And this cooperation has operated smoothly since the end of the Cold War, and in fact, even during the Cold War. However, it can be noted that Finland has not reduced its defense budget since the end of the Cold War. We have not abolished compulsory military service either. And we still have our own solid and credible system of self-defense. It's not so much about having technical equipment available, even if we're currently updating our fleet of fighter jets at great expense, than it is about having the ability to mobilize a trained reserve of 280,000 soldiers, something that no European country is capable of doing, even larger ones.
Whether in Finland or in the Baltic countries, the borders are well guarded. But how should we put it? They're a bit porous and do not always reflect the origins of the local populations. Millions of Russians, established in these territories at the time of communism, stayed there. Once a Russian city, Narva was cut in two, and a well-drawn line now separates Russia from Estonia.
Narva is a particular city, a special place on the border of two worlds. Europe begins in Narva. It is the gateway to Europe and a city where Russian is spoken. Narva is the most Russophone city in the European Union. As I speak Estonian, I belong to a small minority. 96% of residents speak Russian. It's important to understand that less than half of the population are Estonian citizens, and 1 inhabitant in 3 is a citizen of the Russian Federation. This is what makes the city so hard to grasp politically.
In all of the Baltic countries, the same problematic of integration of Russophones haunts the society. They generally live in the least privileged neighborhoods.
It was certainly Russia's fervent desire to retain Russophone populations all over Europe, not just in the Baltic states. Germany, for instance, has 2 million Russophones. Russia has managed to keep older people in its sphere of media influence, but not the young. The ones who came here during the Soviet era had no idea that they were coming to another country, and some still have a very good opinion of Putin, but it's a small minority. The young generation certainly don't think that way. The greatest mistake we could make at the moment would be to suspect that all Russophones support Putin's regime. It would be very damaging to relationships between people here in Estonia. I'm fairly certain we won't make that mistake.
In Riga, the capital of Latvia, you can take a train to Moscow. It's an overnight trip. Today, there are around 450,000 Russophones versus over 1 million Latvian residents. Clashes are commonplace. In a primary school in Riga, a teacher advocates for peace.
My pupils took part in a competition and won. They depicted integration as a fruit salad with apples, pineapples, kiwi fruit, and other fruit. Several different components forming a salad, each with its own flavor. Together, we all integrate and create a new society, our Latvian society. There are some Russians who are voicing out loud that Putin's regime is totally unjust and unacceptable. And there are those who like to speak out, but who are afraid it'll backfire on them, and also against the Russians who are here, given the prevailing attitude towards Russians.
In Finland, 100,000 Russophones have been settled here for generations. From the capital, Helsinki, it is possible to go to St. Petersburg by boat. It takes 14 hours.
The vast majority of Russians living in Finland are middle-class Russians who moved here for one reason or another. They may have fallen in love with a Finnish man or woman, got married, or come here to work. We have always had Russians. We're close to Russia. We share a 1,300-kilometer-long border. Naturally, there will always be Russians who will settle here. Most Russians live a perfectly normal life in Finland. It is sad to observe that racism with respect to Russians and Russophones has already increased in Finland.
Tensions with Russophones are frequent. What is happening in Tallinn, in Estonia, is eloquent. This bronze statue to the memory of Soviet soldiers who fell during World War II was considered by the Russophones as a symbol of the victory against Nazism. But it was perceived by Estonians as the representation of Soviet occupation, therefore of evil. Erected in the heart of the downtown area, in 2007, the government decided to move the Russian soldier to a less exposed site, the military cemetery. The result? Resentment felt among European Russophones who felt humiliated. Old wounds were reopened. But who is manipulating who?
Of course, Russian government-led protests used this moment and then started kind of form a defense of that statue, gathering people around it. So it turned into street riots once the bronze soldier was removed. And at the same time, exactly, the cyberattacks originating from Russia, but as it is in cyberspace, you can guide infected computers all around the world, so the attacks appear to come all around the world, but they were guided from Russia. They commenced against Estonia.
Paralysis of the country's public services and of the whole rail, electrical, and banking system. Particularly targeted attacks, since Estonia had invested heavily in digital technology.
In 1999, Prime Minister Mart Laar instructed his teams to identify the fields of activity with high added value for our economy, in which Estonia could play a preeminent role. One of these sectors was genetic engineering. The second was digital services.
And the aspects of sovereignty is a cyber attack against the nation, a breach of national sovereignty. So it took some new thinking, innovative decisions, calling for allied help, starting new policy initiatives in NATO and amongst our allies to recognize cyber threats more appropriately than before in order to overcome this.
In 2008 in Tallinn, Estonia, the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence was created, which became an international military organization designed to counter Russia's cyber attacks. Estonia, the first victim of the cyber war, has become a global leader in cyber defense. Contemporary war can take on 1,000 faces. Cyber attacks and disinformation, of course, but also corruption, as is the case here in Finland.
Russia has always encroached on Finland's business, attempting to influence its internal policy and decision-making. It's nothing new. We not only keep track of laundered Russian money in Finland, we must be careful that the Russians do not fund politicians or parties in Finland. We really have to watch out for that. The most famous case in Finland was the so-called Ariston Helmi affair, in which a Russian businessman by the name of Pavel Melnikov bought an island and numerous properties near Turku. The police organized a vast operation involving 200 men, as well as representatives from the army. So the police called on the army. During this operation, the airspace was closed for several hours. It was then that everyone understood that something unusual was happening. It was clearly a political operation, in the sense that they wanted to send a message to the Kremlin. We know what goes on within Finland's borders, and we are watching what happens here. It was a political message, in my opinion. The islands of Turku, these islands are close to the deep quarters where the big ships pass. They have strategic importance, but it's not just a question of strategic importance. When the police investigated and soldiers went in, they noted the presence of various kinds of wiretaps and other technologies. This information still remains to be verified, but the site is not just strategic. What was happening there is very important.
Are Finland and its neighbors being bugged?
In 2014, the world was caught off guard. Russia seemed to have all the power in the information sphere. They could steer the world opinion any way they wanted, and the Western governments seemed to be powerless to convince their public of what's really going on. And Russians were really good at doing it. Now, in 2022, I'm really glad to see that with the leadership of United States, with the help of very good intelligence and releasing this intelligence at very good timings, we are beating Russia in information warfare. It's super important. Nobody in the free world is believing the Russian messages anymore.
Apparently, the free world has won. From Berlin to Stockholm, Riga to Helsinki, Tallinn to Vilnius, war seems very far away. Ah, the shores of the Baltic, sun-drenched bodies, the desire to live in peace, vanilla ice cream, and candy floss. But are we walking on a fine sandy beach or on a minefield?
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
And so the unprecedented took place on February 24th, 2022.
I think not only Europe, but perhaps the world will talk in terms of before 24th of February and post 24th of February. After the 24th of February, we understand that there was never probably an intention on the Russian side to actively want to contribute to finding those peaceful solutions.
It is clear that we cannot trust Russia with this face of Putin. He has shown several times what he is capable of, and again recently with this brutal invasion of Ukraine.
A constant contradiction. No respect whatsoever for the international treaties that were signed or for the countries. In fact, we cannot believe a word of what Russia says, whether it be under a leader like Stalin or a leader like Putin.
The indignation is particularly strong from Finland to Germany, from the Baltic states to Poland. In Riga, Latvia, to reach the Russian embassy, you must now go through, after many obstacles, the newly rebaptized Ukrainian Independence Street. The war in Ukraine has shaken up economies, isolated Russians, and has symbolically redrawn an Iron Curtain. The countries of the Baltic Sea are turning definitively towards Europe and America, leaving the Russian Federation to sink into a new solitude. It has now been excluded from the catchment area, spanning over 1.6 million square kilometers.
Concerning the contact with Russia, they've put it on hold. Nowadays, we have no contact anymore with the Russian cities. And passage for Russian ships is currently blocked. We are no longer buying Russian goods or trading with their currencies and banks, etc. Russia is more cut off today than it was in the Soviet era.
With the border closure, people have started to travel less or no longer move at all. The residents of Narva no longer enjoy vodka, cigarettes, and cheap fuel. Narva is no longer a gateway city, but a dead-end city at the limits of Europe. The war in Ukraine has brought about some major changes in Narva's identity. So, how will Narva react to this? It remains to be seen. After the war that Russia provoked, we observed that what we've been doing up until now in terms of security policy was insufficient. As the largest economy in Europe, we also have to acknowledge our responsibilities in the security field and invest more in our armed forces.
And even in Berlin, we find brand new recruitment offices.
To be honest, back in January, as an environmental politician, I would never have imagined that I was going to utter such statements with such conviction. But the geopolitical situation has changed. We are threatened by our great neighbor from the east, and we must react appropriately. That is why we must also diversify our economic relations and cooperate more with other countries in the world. And it is not easy for the German economy, because there had been a very unilateral dependency on Russia, especially in the energy field in recent years.
In terms of energy, there was a sequel to Nord Stream, Nord Stream 2. This new gas pipeline, launched in 2018, promised to double the capacity for Germany's supply of Russian gas. Wishful thinking.
And we were warning our Western friends, specifically German friends, that this is not an economic project from Russian side. This is a geopolitical project in order to make sure that Western Europe cannot be without Russian energy. And we'll have to buy it whatever the cost, either politically, militarily, and otherwise.
It is very clear that Nord Stream 2 was a strategic error. As Greens, the party I belong to, we have always viewed this project with a critical eye. So we followed its development with a critical eye. And I also think that those who worked to implement the project have now come to the conclusion that it was a strategic error to count on Russian energy delivery and make ourselves so dependent. Today, that has led to a great deal of stranded assets. These are investments that have literally drowned in the Baltic Sea, which is truly regrettable.
In September 2021, the construction of Nord Stream 2 was completed. The euphoria was short-lived. Several days after the invasion of Ukraine, the hammer of sanctions fell, and the Nord Stream 2 company was forced to declare bankruptcy.
And so basically Europe was hooked as a drug addict by a steady, continuing flow of cheap Russian drugs. And now we're in a recovery mode. It will be hard, it will be long, it will be costly.
Could the dream of a cooperative and prosperous Baltic Sea be evaporating, and that of a new Hansa with it? Not without difficulty, the Council of the Baltic Sea states had attempted to instigate a community dialogue, notably with Russia. With the war in Ukraine, everything exploded.
What I can say for now is that the member states took decision to suspend Russia in its rights of the member and Belarus in its rights of observer state.
Who will win? No, this story definitely isn't over yet. On June 21st, 2022, Lithuania blocked the freight circulating between Moscow and Kaliningrad. The Russians promise retaliation. Who knows, in the months to come, what state the world will be in? Will Sweden and Finland's NATO membership stoke the flames? Will the 3 Baltic countries be able to preserve their sovereignty? Will the defense of Europe's Russophones be an argument to elicit an intervention from the Kremlin? Is the digital war really no more than an old memory? Will the end of Nord Stream create an environmental recession with the reopening of coal mines? But above all, will the region recover stability and coherency by eventually restoring dialogue with Russia, which is now a major missing piece of the Baltic puzzle?